Imagine waking up one morning, not in your comfortable modern bed, but instead in a modest, dimly lit stone or mud brick house somewhere in ancient Greece, around 400 BCE. The first thing that would hit you is the sheer unfamiliarity and harshness of this ancient world. The air would carry the sense of wood smoke, livestock, and open sewage. Your sleep would have been interrupted by the sounds of roosters chatter in a language you barely understand, and the clang of early morning merchants setting up their stalls. Before you even think about what to eat or wear, you must come to terms with a staggering reality. This world was brutal, unforgiving, and vastly different from anything you've ever known. The conveniences and protections you rely on today, clean running water, sanitation, medical care, a stable food supply, would be utterly absent. You'd be thrown into a society where survival was a constant struggle, not a given. And you? Well, the odds are stacked heavily against you surviving even a single day. First, consider the environmental conditions. Ancient Greece sits in a Mediterranean climate zone, with long, hot, dry summers and mild, wet winters. You don't have air conditioning, modern clothing, or sunblock. Instead, you'd be dressed in simple wool or linen garments that offer minimal protection from the scorching sun, or conversely, from the damp chill of winter nights. The sun's rays beat down mercilessly, and dehydration is a real threat. Drinking water isn't just a turn of the tap away. You'd have to rely on wells, cisterns, or sometimes polluted streams. The Greeks built impressive aqueducts and drainage systems, but in most towns and villages, water quality was uneven at best, leading to frequent outbreaks of waterborne diseases like dysentery and typhoid fever. Imagine how vulnerable your body would be, suddenly exposed to these microbial dangers your immune system hasn't faced before. Hygiene, or the lack thereof, is another major hurdle. Although the Greeks valued cleanliness and public baths were common in urban centers like Athens, these baths were shared spaces with little concept of sterilization or sanitation as we understand it. They could just as easily be breeding grounds for infection. Bathing was often a social activity, yes, but one that came with health risks. People lived closely packed together in cramped houses or city blocks. Waste disposal was primitive. Refuse and human waste were often tossed into streets or the nearest rivers, contaminating the environment. Parasites such as lice and intestinal worms were rampant. You'd likely suffer from infestations and infections that today are easily treated or prevented. Your diet, too, would be a shock. Forget the abundance and variety of modern supermarkets. The typical diet of the average ancient Greek was starkly limited, centered around the Mediterranean triad. Grains, mostly barley, olives and olive oil, and wine diluted with water. Meat was a rarity, reserved mostly for special occasions or the wealthy elite. Instead, you'd eat pulses like lentils and chickpeas, some cheese, seasonal fruits and vegetables, and fish if you lived near the coast. Much of the food was preserved by drying or salting, but spoilage was common. Your meals would be repetitive and often lacking in essential nutrients, making malnutrition and related illnesses common. Worse still, food poisoning from spoiled or contaminated items was a real hazard, especially in the warmer months. Moving from the physical challenges to the social structure, ancient Greece was rigidly hierarchical and exclusive. Citizenship was limited to freeborn adult males of the city-state, often excluding women, slaves, medics, resident foreigners, and others. If you were a woman, your options and freedoms were severely restricted. You would be largely confined to the household, responsible for child rearing and managing domestic affairs, but with little voice in public life. The expectation was obedience and modesty. Stepping outside these roles could lead to social ostracism, or worse. Women's legal rights were minimal. They could not own property independently or vote. If you were a slave, a very real possibility, given that slaves comprised a large percentage of the population, you would have faced harsh labor, poor living conditions, and no legal rights whatsoever. Slaves worked in households, mines, farms, and even in administrative roles, but always under the threat of violence or sale. Life expectancy for slaves was low, and their survival hinged on the will of their owners. Freedom was rare and difficult to attain. Even if you were a free male citizen, life was not a safe or leisurely stroll. The Greek city-states were frequently at war with one another, and the ever-present threat of conflict meant that young men were expected to train as soldiers. Military service was a duty, not a choice, and warfare was brutal. You could easily find yourself thrust into bloody battles, skirmishes, or sieges, with no guarantee of survival. And war was not the only danger. Crime and violence within cities were common. Punishments for crimes ranged from fines to corporal punishment and execution, often carried out publicly to deter others. Legal protections were rudimentary compared to modern standards, and accusations could be politically motivated. Your home and urban environment would pose further challenges. Most Greeks lived in small, poorly insulated homes with earthen floors and thatched or tile roofs. These houses lacked modern conveniences. No electricity, plumbing, or heating beyond the open hearth. Streets were narrow and unpaved, often muddy or dusty, and filled with animals, refuse, and human waste. The noise, smells, and chaos would be overwhelming. Rats and other vermin were common, spreading disease. Fire was a constant hazard, especially since open flames were used for cooking and lighting. Healthcare was primitive. The Greeks developed foundational ideas in medicine and anatomy, thanks to figures like Hippocrates. But their treatments were limited. Herbal remedies, bloodletting, and superstitious practices dominated. Without antibiotics, vaccines, or surgical sterilization, infections could easily turn fatal. Childbirth was perilous for both mother and infant, contributing to high infant mortality rates and low average life expectancy, usually between 30 and 40 years, if you were lucky. Epidemics, such as the devastating plague of Athens in the 5th century BCE, could wipe out huge portions of the population. Religion permeated every aspect of life and could be both a comfort and a source of anxiety. You would be expected to honor numerous gods through sacrifices, rituals, and festivals. Failing to perform these rites correctly or offending the gods could lead to social backlash or accusations of impiety. Religious and superstitious fears influenced medicine, justice, and politics. Accusations of heresy or disrespect to the gods could end in trial and death, as famously happened to Socrates. Travel was slow, difficult, and dangerous. Roads were rough and poorly maintained, and traveling between city-states required days or weeks on foot or by horse. Sea voyages were risky, vulnerable to storms and pirates. You would be exposed to theft, assault, or illness during journeys. education was reserved for wealthy males and focused heavily on rhetoric, philosophy, and physical training. If you were poor or female, your chances of receiving formal education were slim. Your future would likely be predetermined by your birth class, family, and gender. In sum, the average day in ancient Greece was filled with physical discomfort, social constraints, and constant threats, far from the romanticized image of philosophers in togas discussing ideas on sunlit plazas. Instead, life was a daily test of endurance, resilience, and acceptance of the hardships inherent in the ancient world. Your modern body and mind would struggle against the diseases, the heat, the poor nutrition, the social inequality, and the ever-present dangers. You wouldn't survive a day, not because the Greeks were cruel or barbaric, but because their world was harsh and humanity's progress in medicine, sanitation, nutrition, and human rights hadn't yet made life safer or easier. Yet, despite these difficulties, the people of ancient Greece built foundations of culture, science, and democracy that still influence us today, a testament to human resilience and ingenuity. So, next time you admire the legacy of ancient Greece, spare a thought for the everyday lives behind the grandeur. And remember, if you were truly transported back, you might not last even a single day.